how many people are from the policy or the nonprofit world? So you got a little bit of a mixed audience. I'm a little curious, since you've been working on this for 2 decades, how did you get into the work that you do?
You know, it was kind of random. Actually, I applied for a truck driving job at the food bank in San Mateo County, and then they hired me as a secretary. And because apparently I didn't fit the truck driving thing, but at the food bank shared offices with the Hunger and Homeless Action Coalition of San Mateo County, which is no longer in existence. But I ended up doing administrative work for them, and then became the executive director. And I just, the thing that stuck me in it is that I see homelessness as this place where all these different oppressions intersect. And you walk into a homeless shelter, you see overrepresentation of African Americans, you see a lot of folks with disabilities, you see a lot of representatives of the LGBT community, all these different folks that have these different oppressions, and yet it's a community that's still okay to hate. And so, for me, I'm sticking with it because obviously the job's not done.
And I mean, if we're gonna think about homelessness as a structure in San Francisco, it's not something that's been around really visibly for the entire history of the city. It's something that is a phenomenon that appeared at a pretty specific point in time, about 30 or 40 years ago, right?
Yeah. And basically in the early 1980s, we had a situation where the federal government decided to get out of the business of housing, and little by little, not just housing, basically deconstructed everything that had been in place since the New Deal. And we had massive cuts to public assistance. Actually, everybody got cut. People don't know this, they always think deinstitutionalization, but in 1980, everyone lost their disability benefits. And there was a lawsuit that prevailed, and there was
that was a federal program? Or?
Yeah, federal disability, Social Security. So everyone who was receiving Social Security that was on SSDI, which is the non-employment-based one, for folks who were disabled all of their lives. They lost their disability, many of them lost their housing, and so they had to then reapply. For folks with psychiatric disabilities, it was very difficult for that reapplication process. So we had a change in the economy, much more shift over to service sector jobs. All of these things, ended up intersecting to create this explosion where we suddenly had over 1 million men, women, and children in the United States that didn't have a place to call home.
And this was like a pretty interesting time in the history of American cities too, because this is the early 80s, and if you look at the history of San Francisco, this is a low point in San Francisco's population. Like San Francisco had experienced a lot of middle class flight, white flight, from 1950 to 1980 as the population went down. So you were left with this core, and homelessness sort of appeared as a visible phenomenon at the time. And the city really didn't know how to react to it at the time, right?
Yeah, they basically thought of it as an emergency situation, and the federal government too. Yeah. I mean, everybody across the country. Suddenly we have these, people started opening up homeless shelters. We didn't know, people didn't ever try to get at the systemic causes. Sadly, they really haven't since. We've just had a series of really bad policy decisions that have further perpetuated homelessness.
But I mean, it's also like, if you go even before that, there's reasons for that. There are like ideological reasons for that shift from providing public housing into going into, vouchers and subsidies and then tax credits. Because like the public housing in the 1960s and a lot of the processes that we did from, building enormous public housing projects, obliterating existing neighborhood and neighborhood fabrics and building these giant modernist towers. There was a lot of reaction to that as well because it was poorly designed. If we could talk a little bit, so homelessness appears at that point, and then we go through a series of different approaches for all the different mayors of San Francisco, right? Like they're fine-sanded shelters, and then what happened after that?
Right, so we had, after that we had Art Agnos, who was a social worker mayor,
yeah.
And he basically wanted to do the Beyond Shelter, and he released a report and created, actually we had the earthquake during his time, so he was able to use a lot of the money that came in under earthquakes to open up, he opened up some large shelters in San Francisco, multi-service centers. There was large numbers of people who were experiencing homeless at that time that camped out, Camp Agnos, and he ended up being a one-term mayor, in part because of...
it was so visible.
Because it was so visible.
There was an enormous homeless camp in front of City Hall. I think at the end of his term was like the early 90s.
Yeah.
And then the voters reacted against that, and they elected Frank Jordan.
They elected Frank Jordan, who was a police officer, who was a police chief, who was very much get tough on homeless. And then he did the Matrix program, which basically criminalized homeless people really severely, publicly took away their property, destroyed it, ticketed, arrested, jailed, did this really, really harsh approach. And he ended up being a one-term mayor as well. There was a big public backlash against his treatment of homeless people at the time.
And then we did Willie Brown, and Willie Brown what was his strategy?
So Willie Brown was, you know, I mean, he's the master politician anyway. He was going to get elected no matter what. Yeah. But he did, you know, a campaign on an anti-Matrix platform. He wrote an opinion editorial in the Chronicle before he was elected. He really blasted Jordan. There was, you know, some other stuff that was happening with Jordan that we were joking about. You know, he got caught in the shower with this radio program.
Just like this naked shower photos. Like I was a kid at the time, and I still remember that naked shower photo.
Yeah.
But anyway, so we went from criminalization to Willie Brown did a lot of redevelopment to the city. I don't remember his policy.
Yeah. Well, Willie Brown did some really problematic stuff. I mean, but he actually did continue really severe criminalization.
Yeah.
But he also invested really heavily in substance abuse treatment. He also made sure that homeless services were available in all poor neighborhoods. And so there was a lot of investment in Bayview Hunters Point, which has sometimes the largest and sometimes the second largest homeless population. Homelessness is a poverty issue. You go in a poor neighborhood, you're going to have homeless people. So somehow in people's mind that gets separated, but homeless people are poor people. They live in poor communities. And that's where they're at. So he did big treatment on demand. He used a lot of redevelopment monies to actually invest in affordable housing that went towards homeless people. He actually didn't get credit for that, but it came to fruition under Newsom.
Okay. And then under Newsom we had Care Not Cash.
Right.
Which was, can you explain a little bit of what that was?
Yeah. So you know so from homeless people's perspective, Gavin Newsom ran on an anti-homeless platform. Yeah. And so he basically did, he cut public assistance for homeless people by 85%. That money was put into a pot of money that for a very small fraction of homeless people was used as subsidies to private landlords in residential hotels. And that was called Care Not Cash. But for the most part, folks got their benefits reduced, ended up in shelter. And then the year of his election, he put the panhandling measure on the ballot, which is 6 months in jail for asking for alms twice, which was rather harsh. And then he put Care Not Cash on the ballot, 6 months in jail on the second offense for sitting or lying on a sidewalk during daytime hours. So pretty overall, very anti-homeless platform. While he was doing that though, he was also investing in supportive housing and did build the supportive housing, you know, sort of like the leather glove.
Can you explain what supportive housing is?
Yeah, so he invested in housing that is housing where the definition is that it's permanent. So it's not like temporary housing. You're going to stay there forever, you know, as long as you don't violate your lease or whatever, and you pay your portion of the rent. So it's permanent and it's affordable. So 30% of your income is spent on rent. And that it's supportive. And what they mean by supportive is that they're putting support services in there, which are mostly focused on keeping people in housing. And so, and it's specifically designed for people who have other kinds of behavioral health issues and barriers to succeeding. So folks with psychiatric disabilities, folks with addictive disorders, folks with HIV/AIDS, other kind of physical health issues that are creating really big barriers for them. And so the support services are generally put on site you know, to assist people so that they can be successful in housing. Okay,
so, and then now we have Mayor Lee and his approach. What's his approach to homelessness?
So at least kind of, for the most part, backed away. I mean, he just did the Navigation Center, but for the most part, he really has divested from housing. So if you look at his pipeline moving forward compared to Newsom and Brown, Newsom and Brown, so the city has affordable housing buildings that are built on city land that are used some kind of federal, state, or local government. Usually a combination of those is funding the buildings and the construction. It's called affordable housing. And in the last decade under Newsom and under Brown, about 40% of that housing was for homeless people. Looking forward on at least next 5 years, which is how much longer he has in office if he wins this next election, He has about 12% of the units for homeless people. So he's actually really retreated from this commitment that the city has had, at least over the last decade, to ensuring that we have at least some level of housing for homeless people.
Okay, so if we look at that whole 30-year thing, it's like you've got shelters, you've got you know, get tough on homelessness and criminalization, you've got care.cash, you've got supportive housing. Like, where are we? Have we made any progress? When you think about that, those 3 decades,
yeah.
San Francisco trying to address homelessness, what is that?
Yeah, so we look at our results. So we have, if we look at us compared to other cities, and another contrary to popular belief, we don't have a higher proportion of homeless people here than other urban areas. But basically, we have been able to keep the population steady on overall, the single adult population, with some exceptions. Veterans, we've brought down. You know, there's some other subpopulations that have been brought down. And then families have totally skyrocketed, families with children.
Yeah, I think the population is 6,000 people?
Yeah, about roughly 6.5.
And what is that? What are the demographics of the whole population look like?
So it's about, so looking at ethnicity, it's overwhelming people of color, minority white folks. You have 63% people with disabilities. You have kind of this age spread where you have a lot of elders and then a lot of young people. About 40% of the population is families with kids. So it's that's a pretty large chunk of it. You got a good percentage of veterans in there, about 15%, about 20% immigrants. And you're saying there's more families now than there were 5-6 years ago? Yeah, so the families with children has been like the biggest policy disaster for San Francisco. And it's awful. So the end of the last school year, we had 2,352 public school students who were homeless in San Francisco. And
what does that look? I mean, when you say they're homeless, is that they're living in their cars, or they don't have a home, they're living with extended family members, or they're actually homeless and sleeping on the street, or they're in shelter?
It's all of the above. Yeah, all of the above. And so, and oftentimes a mix of that. And so, like, trying to get shelter takes about 9 months. They'll be staying with some families, maybe a few nights in the motel at the beginning of the month, staying in a church basement, sleeping in their car. So most of the families that that's usually a mix where they're very unstable and they're staying in a bunch of different places, which. A lot of our policy focus in San Francisco families is just on families with shelters. We have a really small shelter system.
Yeah. And how many shelter beds do we have in San Francisco?
So altogether we have about 1,200 beds. Yeah, so we have about one shelter bed for about every 5.5 homeless people.
Okay. Yeah. And then we also, so 6,000 homeless people, 1,200 shelter beds, and then there's another, you were saying earlier, 6,000 people in, what is it, your supportive housing? Or
in some form of housing, supportive or not.
Okay.
That's a city housing tract.
Okay. Yeah. And how much are we spending per year on homelessness?
So we're spending about $120 million, which seems like a lot. It's about 2% of our city's general fund budget. So it's not, in comparison, people like the Chronicle's always blowing it up and they add a bunch of dollars to that. But the controller would say 120 million. 60 million is for the front-end emergency services, healthcare, shelters, drop-in centers, some drop-in psychiatric treatment, stuff like that. And then 60 million is the housing piece that's paying to keep people housed that were formerly homeless.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful to explain to a lot of people, since we have a big tech audience here, what does that housing look like when you go around? There's a class of housing in San Francisco called single room occupancy hotels, which is a specific class of housing that was created in the 1970s specifically for low-income tenants. That's one form.
Well, it wasn't created then.
Well, it wasn't created or preserved.
That's our real thing. I think people typically will just call them residential hotels, but like they've housed sailors and dock workers and stuff like that since the turn of the century. Most of them, some of them mid-1800s, some of them were that old.
Okay. So one article that I've seen passed around a lot in the last year, it's the experiment that Utah did with the policy of housing first. What do you think of that, and how applicable is it here in this crazy market?
Yeah, so so this is this idea that Utah is solving solving homelessness or solving homelessness for a portion of the population.
Yeah, I mean, Utah embarked on this for, was it Salt Lake City or was it Utah, the state? Was it?
They did it for the whole state, actually.
Yeah.
But
so they just said, we're going to just provide everyone with housing and then see how, like, expense-wise, how it works out, you know, if we just house them versus not housing them and then having to do a lot of, like, emergency first-line care. And it was cheaper to just house them.
Just house them, yeah. And we knew that already.
Yeah.
So we're actually spending more money to keep people homeless. I think it is applicable in that, you know, there was a huge amount of political will, and some of that comes, you know, came from the Mormon Church, and you know, came from different places, but the politicians really embraced it, and everyone got on board, and it kind of crossed, you know, it crossed a lot of. Well, you know, you think of Utah as being more conservative or more, you know, that they wouldn't go for something like this, and I think it just demonstrated that, you know, no matter where people are coming from an ideological perspective, it just doesn't make sense to keep people homeless.
Yeah.
And it also, this idea that people are choosing to be homeless is just complete and utter bullshit. You know, like we do a ton of outreach to homeless people. We've never ever come across folks. We're probably talking to hundreds of people a week that, you know, once you dig down into it, they don't have a choice but to be there. And so, and if you offer them safe and decent, affordable housing, they jump on it. Rare exception, you know, one guy, you know, in a million, PTSD, war veteran, can't be inside walls. You know, I mean, it's just not that common. So, folks are suffering really badly, and their health is deteriorating, and it's miserable. It's really miserable. It's not like this free and loving lifestyle that we sort of, you know, have, I think tell ourselves or feel like, you know, like, so we don't feel so bad about it, but it's awful.
But I mean, the issue with housing first here is, of course, like the cost of land, the cost of construction is just astronomical. It's just astronomical. Like, you look at what it takes to build a permanently affordable unit, and it's hundreds of thousands of dollars in subsidies. So if you multiply that over, you know, thousands of units, and you know, for example, the city is going to try and push a $250 million affordable housing bond in November, which sounds like a lot of paper, but you're talking about, you know, $200,000, $300,000, $500,000 in subsidies per unit. It's not going to go very far.
Right.
And the city can't legally do more than that, or they can do more than that, but then that more than $250 million becomes large enough that it would effectively trigger a new tax. And under California state law, if you're going to do a new tax, you have to get a majority vote from the voters.
Super majority.
Yeah. So, yeah, like two-thirds majority. So, basically, the city's in this position where they can only really ask for this like super small bond that doesn't actually really do much, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, like when I think about housing first here, it just seems like it is cheaper, but then the mechanics of doing it, the mechanics of financing it, just seems so overwhelmingly impossible.
It is, but I mean, we're spending the money because we're spending the money at General Hospital, where, you know, I mean, so it's really expensive.
Like that 120 million, is that calculating on all that stuff from the San Francisco General and as well? It
is for certain elements of it. It doesn't capture all of it.
Yeah.
And so it's capturing the homeless specific programming that is available through the Department of Public Health. It's not capturing just the stuff that people who's coming into an emergency room. It's not capturing that.
Yeah.
So so yeah, the costs from that perspective are much higher. And I think you know, when we think about, so those costs per unit are for the most part one-time costs because it's land acquisition and construction. And so the ongoing operation of the house, you know, in terms of, so looking at the affordable housing that the city's already going to do, which they're not setting aside units for homeless people, for example, it would only cost an additional $6,000 a unit for the operating subsidy to bring down the rents. So it wouldn't cost that much if you're looking.
You're talking about just subsidizing their rents, right? Or like,
exactly. Yeah. Just, well, they do it as an operating subsidy, so it's covering the cost of operating the building, but in tangible terms, it's drawing down the rent for the homeless person moving in. They can afford it now, whereas before they couldn't. So,
do you deal with a lot of discrimination when your client, you know, the population that you work with has those kinds of subsidies and is trying to rent stuff?
Yeah. So these buildings are city operated, nonprofit operated. So we don't have the same level of discrimination. We still do. Like some of the nonprofit housing providers like to cream and have people that have less, you know, issues, that they're going to be easier to live in their building. That certainly happens, but not that kind of discrimination that you're talking about is referring to when we're using subsidies in the private market with private landlords. So Section 8 is the classic example. So it's really hard to get landlords to rent to Section 8 tenants just on class bias alone.
Yeah.
And that enters in a lot of, you know, in a lot of different areas. There was just a huge effort with veterans, right? That was just in the news, and the city's really been trying to they got all the Obama administration's like, we're going to end homelessness for veterans, so they're throwing a lot of money down on it, and they're saying, look, we're going to give you all these subsidies, and in San Francisco, we're trying to get landlords to rent to people, and it's hard to get the landlords to do it. We've actually, the only landlords, I think, is the Chinese landlords. Chinese Landlord Association has been super, super helpful, and that's the only place where it's been.
So let's talk about solutions. We talked a little bit about solutions. Talk about housing first. We've got this budget. We've got $120 million per year in spending, 6,000 homeless people, some of the highest housing costs, highest landed costs in the entire nation. What do we do? How do we get out of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so. For us, we're always trying to lay out what's doable, you know, in terms of within the city, because our organization really focuses on San Francisco. We do a lot of outreach to homeless people based on what they're saying is what we're pushing for. And so, for example, the last couple years, we've been pushing for this very large initiative, Keeping San Franciscans Housed and Housing San Franciscans, about a $12 million proposal. And that, you know, we're really focusing on keeping people in their homes. So we need to do a lot of prevention, and that's totally doable. And that takes, you know, an investment in terms of right to counsel. A large proportion of our homeless population is becoming homeless directly as a result of eviction, and that's why we're continuing to have these, you know, high numbers, even though we're investing in housing, that we're basically creating exits out, and then we have this front door open wide where people are entering into homelessness. And so, so that's one piece, and that is not so expensive. You know, we've gotten a couple $1 million in the city. We're probably about $2 million short. We think we'll get to full right to counsel. We'll be able to have comprehensive back rent for people when they need it. There's some other subsidies that need to happen that cost a few million more. Basically, we have elders that are going to be dropping their income. We want to keep them in their housing. And we've identified them. There's like 1,200 of them. So there's these different pieces. So we know what needs to be done there in terms of keeping people in their homes. We need to, in terms of the private market subsidies, which is one area we're always looking at, we're kind of reaching the threshold to a certain extent on that. But we can do a bit there. And we can do a few more subsidies, and probably the city can support maybe an additional 300 subsidies in the private market. We think we'd be able to get people in housing through that. And that's just basically, in a private landlord, a little subsidy makes up the difference between income and rent. And so that's doable. And then we still have this huge gap. And so for us, we're looking at, okay, we need to prioritize. And we're looking at who is the city really severely neglected? Who's having the biggest issues right now? It's families with kids. And so when I talked about that mushrooming population, it's doubled. We can solve family homelessness in San Francisco really easily.
It's 2,500 kids in the San Francisco Unified School District.
Yeah, it's about 3,300 if you extrapolate for 0 to 5, age 0 to 5, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how many families does that represent?
It's about a little bit less than 1,200 families.
Okay, so 1,200, you're estimating there are 1,200 homeless families in San Francisco. How much would you need to house those families? $11
million over 5 years. That's it.
Yeah. Okay. And that's just for subsidies for their.
So that's taking those affordable housing developments that I talked about that the mayor backed away from, putting families in there at about 30% per building.
Yeah.
So there's 100 units, 30 of them going in for families. Those are at Shipyard. There's another one coming in at Mission Bay. There's where the Octavia, you know, where the freeway used to be, so there's some public lands there we're putting in there. Yeah, so a number of different city-owned land. We put the subsidies in. We keep prioritizing families for public housing, so when the turnover units come, they get to move into those. And then we build on the private subsidies that I had mentioned before. And altogether, over 5 years, we would be able to house every homeless family. We invest in prevention. And then we'd have about 600 units left over for those situations where we just can't do anything about. Domestic violence, fire, you know, those situations that come up that people become homeless suddenly, that no matter how much government intervention we throw at it, we're not going to be able to do it. So for those families, we rapidly get them back into housing. We'd be able to eliminate our 9-month wait list for shelter. So in those situations, we get the family, they'd be able to be in shelter, a lot more stabilizing.
I'm looking to like work it out here because I'm like $12 million over 5 years. I mean, I'm like $12 million is like 6 homes here or something.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, because it's housing that's already built.
Yeah.
That we just need to put the operating subsidy in there. Yeah.
Oh, is this public housing or is this what? So
this is
public housing.
This is like the stuff in the shipyards and the it's not public housing in the at the San Francisco Housing Authority, but it's publicly funded, privately developed housing that's affordable housing developed by nonprofit.
Okay. Yeah. So what is the technology industry's role here? What do you see a role for the tech industry to play? You know, I think Rose is obviously running a hand up. But what else? Yeah,
I mean, I think, you know, you know, for us at the coalition, it's really important for us to be accountable to homeless people. And I think for folks who want to get involved, and you know, we were just talking before about Greg Gottman. You guys know who he is. So he's the one who made all the super nasty comments about.
Are you a fan or a skeptic or a?
Well, you know, so here's this guy he made a bunch of horrible comments, and then a year later he wanted to come around. But you know what, and I had met with him, and one of the things that he was unwilling to do was that he was unwilling to act in solidarity with folks who are already working on these issues with homeless people to develop solutions. He wanted to come up with his own solutions. He thought tech knows better than the homeless providers. Like, you guys are screwed up because you know, we still have all these homeless people, you don't know what you're doing. I know better than you and stuff like that. And so, you know, I had to have conversations about him about, you know, his level of arrogance in his approach, and that actually, you know, doing a campground may not be the best way to go for San Francisco, and that's not necessarily what homeless people want. And when we're checking in with homeless people, they're like, oh no, we want safe and decent affordable housing. And so it's really important, I think, as people, and it can be really super helpful because, you know, we're not gonna be able to shift this around if it's only homeless people are, you know, fighting as a group for, you know, we need solidarity. We need other folks that are working with us that are going to be fighting side by side. And so I just think that that role is really important to, you know, get involved, but do it in a really respectful way in terms of, you know, going to folks who know what to do, and then figuring out, asking what kind of support folks need and how you can help. There's such a lot to be done. I mean, we have an organization where we're 75% homeless staff. We have 9 staff spread around across about 4 FTEs because we're all part-time, except for one of us, not me. I'm part-time. And it's like an overwhelming amount of work. And I think about all the stuff we could be doing constantly. Like, God damn it, like, you know, there's so much more to do. Like, we could do all this stuff, but we just don't have the resources to do it. We don't have there's just not enough staffing hours in the day, not enough volunteers, all of that stuff. So there's so much to be done, and it's everything from research to, we'll be having a meeting with the mayor coming up, and we're going to be pitching this 5-year roadmap to end family homelessness. Like, you know, getting involved, endorsing the plan, like contacting the mayor's office, pushing him to do something. This is a scandal, mayor. This is a scandal. You got all these kids without a place to live. What are you doing? You need to respond to this, and just, you know, keeping that pressure alive. And so there's a lot we can all do, because we created this homeless problem. So, you know, it's going to take all of us to fight to, you know, to end it.
I mean, like, in the absence of, you know, like a massive amount of state or federal funding, you know, like existed in the mid-20th century, and what can San Francisco as an individual city realistically do or afford to do, given its land costs, given the restraints it has as a city on how it can raise money for taxes and stuff like that.
Yeah, and
it feels like we've been, you know, it's like purgatory prayer.
Right,
you know?
right. Well, and it is, because the federal government created the problem, right? And then it's washing its hands, and then it's asking the local governments to do something about it. The local governments go,
yeah.
Okay, I got the call.
It's a pretty complicated, a pretty complicated thing. I mean, when you look at federal spending at the federal level, like the housing and urban development budget, for example, I think it's like $48 billion per year. But if you look at the subsidies in the form of the mortgage interest tax deduction to homeowners who are typically middle and upper class. It's about $170 billion a year. So we already have this federal policy that's kind of like, benefiting a middle and upper class in a very like tax-exempt way. And then we have an urban development budget meant for low-income communities that's significantly smaller, and then also comes tied with all this other kind of conditionality.
Right.
So it's a difficult situation, and like a lot of cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York are just asked to do this kind of on their own.
Right. Yeah, and it's an impossible task. San Francisco could do a lot more. I mean, our policy, generally speaking, is let's make it as uncomfortable for people as much as we can, and then they're going to disappear. That's obviously a failed policy. Look around. There's a lot of nastiness to the way that homeless programs are run in San Francisco, and that's very deliberate.
Nastiness, you mean you're talking about the mayoral level, or you're talking
all the way down to the Human Service Agency to, they're always passing, like for example, so if you're trying to get a shelter bed in San Francisco, you have to get finger imaged. And they spent, a multi-million-dollar system to do biometric imaging on all homeless people seeking shelter. It's total bullshit. So they do that. The reason they do it is to bust you for welfare fraud. Because if you say that you're homeless, if you're housed and you get a larger check, they haven't busted anybody, so it's a total waste of money. And then they basically, set up this system where, you're spending literally up to 17 hours a day just trying to get a shelter bed. So we had a fight for a long time to try to get them to do it. We're like halfway there. We got part of the system changed, but not the whole one. But they're always doing stuff like that. Like they just want to make it really uncomfortable for people. And they'll tell you that. They'll say, well, we don't want people to get too comfortable. So there's that piece of it, which is awful. And I think that is a result of the federal neglect, because the cities are like, well, we can't do anything, so we're gonna try this other stuff and just make it uncomfortable. And then they spend a lot of resources on criminalization, and that's not good. Homeless people get thousands of tickets every year. They can't pay the fine. It goes to warrant. It screws up their credit. They get kicked off the housing waiting list. It perpetuates homelessness. They get sleep deprivation because they're constantly having to move all night long. You can't even get 8 hours of sleep is a miracle, and and that has really serious health consequences for people. And so it's brutal. And so I think so there's those pieces of things that the city could do that could be a lot better. That they can approach things from a much more humane perspective. They can certainly end homelessness for families with kids. They're probably going to be able to do a lot for vets. We're going to be left with these chunk of people that we need to address. And for those folks, we as a city, and the mayor should be first in line, should be yelling and screaming at that federal government that they need to take responsibility.
I don't know. Like I'm sitting all the way here in San Francisco on the West Coast. Like that seems so, to me, like asking for the federal government for more additional funding for like homelessness and poverty. It seems like such a Herculean task.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it is. But everything
it feels
we
like
do
this.
is,
The American government has fueled the development of suburbs and highways and private automobile transit over the last 50 years, and has disinvested in urban environments and cities, even though they produce most of the economic output of this economy.
Yeah, it is an uphill battle, but if we have successes in these different areas, like for example, if we end up being really successful as a country with veterans, I think that things can start shifting, and we can kind of move away from this idea that it's an intractable, unsolvable problem, and that is a huge barrier. And this idea that people are choosing to be homeless, and that if you do anything, you're going to be a magnet for homeless people, all of it's total bullshit. So we know what to do, we know how to solve it, and we can shift. And so we're doing this veteran thing, which is huge. We had this whole kind of shift around housing first. That was a huge shift, right?
Yeah.
It was like all of a sudden they were like, ding, ding, ding. If you house people, whoa, that's going to solve homelessness. Like housing is the solution. It was so incredibly brilliant. So, and then that was a shift. So we're having these shifts. So we got to move out of this intractable position, and we got to do it, and we fight. We'll keep. We've been so successful in San Francisco from Coalition on Homelessness perspective. So successful with this little grassroots organization that has a shitty little office, and underpaid, really, stretched thin, barely housed. Two of my staff this last weekend became homeless. We're struggling, and we're still with all of that, and we got the first wage raises in 12 years. We're now up to $15 an hour. We all earn the same amount, so we're really struggling. So we've been able to do basically, 1,000 units of housing as a result of our work, over 800 families getting subsidies in the private market, expanding substance abuse treatment by like 1,200 slots, keeping about 1,800 households housed in San Francisco, all of this stuff.
So you were attributing a lot of it, we'll get to audience questions in a second, but you were attributing a lot to like loss of federal programs and federal funding for low-income housing at the beginning of the 1980s. But there's also this conversation about deinstitutionalization that happened in the 1960s and 1970s in California, and then insufficient funding for a new mental health strategy, after that. And
Yeah.
how much does the way we think about and approach mental health, play into homelessness in San Francisco?
Well, we would argue it was not deinstitutionalization.
Okay.
And so we would argue that it was the Social Security cuts that happened. Deinstitutionalization, when deinstitutionalization happened, we had a flourishing community mental health system in San Francisco. We had a huge number of boarding care facilities, and old hippies owned all these Victorians. They'd be boarding care, you use your disability, that's how you pay for it. We lost 1,700 of those slots between the 80s and about midway through the 90s. That because the owners, the kids would grow up, the owners would retire, or they would pass away, and then the kids would divide the property or sell the property or whatever. They weren't interested in continuing. That was something was kind of hard to do a lot about. But we had realignment, and realignment meant that all the community funding in San Francisco, it was this kind of bullshit thing the state did to make it seem like they're moving money around, but they actually just took money out. So we lost a lot of our mental health treatment. That is a huge piece. It is impossible, though, to have your mental health addressed if you don't have housing. And so we need to have people in housing, and then we need to make sure they have access to treatment. Yeah.
I'd like to open it up to audience questions. You guys, yeah.
Yeah, so I liked that you really touched on about the part about evictions, because I feel like instead of facing a lot of the results, like, what are the things that, like, as a government entity, like, they can do to prevent that door to even for people to even start to look for, have to get kicked out of the house and look for affordable housing, especially after the passing of the Ellis Act and all those stuff. A lot of the tenants are under the threats when they're not legally actually able to get kicked out of the housing, but they're facing those threats without legal help. They fear, and then they end up losing their efforts that we done in those areas.
Yeah. So one of the things we're trying to do, we're trying to get the city to fund this year in the budget process. We want them to fund efforts to door knock in culturally specific languages that folks speak, door to door, make sure people have access to their tenant rights, know that if the landlord's telling them to move, they actually don't need to move. And then we need to make sure that we have access to lawyers who can take people all the way through court proceedings and go all the way to trial. So we have strong tenant rights in San Francisco, but the problem has been that we haven't had any free legal assistance for people past the settlement phase. And so for the landlords, they knew that, and the lawyers for the tenants didn't have any muscle in those negotiations, because the only threat they have is we're going to take it to trial, which is going to cost the landlord a buttload of money. And there was no threat there. And so everybody got settled, and what that settlement was moving out. So the best the tenant attorneys could do was get you a little bit of money to move in somewhere else. Well, we know, I mean, you get it. It doesn't last very long. You get a free, a few grand. It's, so we were able to shift that. And so now we have lawyers and really changing the tenant rights system. We have lawyers that go all the way to trial. Those percentages have flipped around the number of people being asked to move out. But we still need all the outreach, because a lot of, just like you said, a ton of the displacement that's happening is happening that is totally preventable, just because people don't realize that that they can stand up to their landlord. Classic example. One of my coworkers, he's he lives with his auntie. His auntie's monolingual Chinese speaking. She's been in her place for 37 years. The landlord told her she had to move out. She thought she did, and then he was able to assist her and basically say, like, let her know what the laws were and stuff like that. And she was ready to move out. I don't know what she would have done. She's on a fixed income, but then she was like, okay, yeah, I guess, because she just didn't know what the system was here. Yeah.
Do you have a number for the number of people in San Francisco at risk of having to move out?
You know, we don't actually. And so we know how many evictions take place, which are several thousand a year. About half of those never even respond to the unlawful detainer. So we don't even know what's happening with them. And so that's why the outreach is so key. And so we don't know.
And then do you guys do, I know there's some groups in the mission that do some community organizing focused on, and I'm sure all over the city. Do you also work with them?
Yeah, we do, absolutely. So we put like we're putting together the budget proposal to prevention and keep people housed. We're working with all the tenant rights groups and stuff to come up with it, and then we do all this analysis about exactly what the shortcomings are and how much it would cost and where the gaps in the system are and all of that. And so all the different organizations take place in that, absolutely. Yeah.
So I've got two questions. What's your estimate of the people that we don't know about?
In terms of for homeless people that are like doubled up and stuff?
Or potentially illegal immigrants that aren't coming out, or students which like haven't been taken care of yet, or, you know what I mean? Like what's the unknown contingent part of it?
So we, other municipalities do a good job at that. We don't in San Francisco. So like Los Angeles does a whole door knocking thing, and they do a whole assessment around people who are doubled up. We don't. So our best data actually comes from the school district, and so that's leaving out the kids 0 to 5, and then it's leaving out students over the age of, over high school age, so college students that are doubling up and moving around. And so, you kind of end up having to piecemeal it together. But if we look at Unified, that does include a large chunk of doubled up people. And then we can look at also homeless youth providers, like the number of youth that are coming up through that are aged 18 to 24. We have some idea on that. That's a couple thousand, but we really don't have strong numbers. So, when I come up with that number on the number of kids, we're assuming we're counting a good chunk of the doubled up, but that's really depending on them being identified by the school.
We have one in the back. Sorry.
Jennifer, you talked a lot about the government support that needs to come in. I'm curious, what is your take on the support from the private sector? And specifically, there are a number of companies in San Francisco that signed an agreement with the city to donate to homelessness projects in exchange for tax breaks.
Yeah.
Is that money going to the right places, or what's your take on the whole private sector scene?
Yeah, so that's been a challenge. I have not been working on that piece really closely, but I know that there's been, for the most part, when those community benefits, have been looked at, that they have been pretty paltry in terms of what the give back from the companies has been. There's been some exceptions to that, and some of the companies are doing a nice job. Generally speaking, for the private investment, you're really talking about stuff, getting the private investors to cover one-time costs. Because it's really difficult to get a private investor to commit to giving money every year until infinity. And so when it's best used is when it's those one-time things. And so one great example of that is shallow rental subsidies that are short-term. And there's been companies that have funded that, and then the families are able to kind of get on their feet after 12 months to 18 months, and then that's a one-time investment. And and it's even better when the private companies say, we're going to give this chunk of change, but we want you, the city, to match it. And Benioff did that when he did the Home for the Holidays money, and then they stopped doing it after that. I don't know why, but I thought it was really cool because, of course, the city said yes immediately in a way that they never would have otherwise. And so, so that kind of leverage is super helpful too.
I would generally say that if you're talking about housing low-income communities, if you look at the various permanently affordable projects that are being built and the sheer cost of building a unit, I mean, it takes an enormous amount of money to do it, to build new permanently affordable units anywhere, 200, 300, 500, and 600. There's one at 7th that I think is going to be coming at $690,000 $1,000. So it's the scale and the amount of money that's necessary to effectively do it is much larger than a lot of the private sector philanthropic donations. It's like of an enormous scale. It needs to be significantly larger than, you know, 1 million or 2 million here or there.
Yeah, although a lot of the tech companies, I mean, not the workers, but the owners have that money. I mean, there is a tremendous amount of wealth. And I think for construction, that's another place, but, you know, I think, you know, there's some people out there that have that kind of income.
There are, but it's sort of, if you're taking it out of, say, like a publicly traded company that has shareholders, they have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders, and the amount of capital that's necessary, like the sheer amount of money that would be necessary to actually address the limited population here is so enormous that, you know, a one-off philanthropic donation from a company is not going to cover it. Like, you could potentially say if an individual wants to make that contribution and they have the type of wealth, that's certainly possible and within their will. But I don't think that a company or a corporation that could legally, you know, do that
I got what you're saying. Yeah.
Which is why the private sector, I mean, like, you know, like there's also like the non-profit sector, which provides and builds a lot of housing and maintains and runs a lot of housing in neighborhoods like the Tenderloin, which isn't, you know, the city government as well. So, and they play a really, really important role.
First of all, Jennifer, thank you for so many years of working.
Oh, you're welcome.
Actually,
my pleasure.
I'm actually on the board of Compass Family Services.
Oh, nice.
I actually worked at Compass many years ago with Arnett Watson.
Yeah.
One thing about the land costs, I wonder in your 5-year plan, where is the requirement or demand that the city allocate city land for housing? You know, I know the City College recently sold off its property at Gulf Street to a developer. You know, that's true.
Yeah.
Housing is a major expense, but you can get the land for free or $1 a year for a lease.
Yeah.
That reduces the cost. I think that's where I think really is an opportunity. Where I think we really should be getting engaged with saying, you know, any city property or the port, the school district, MTA, all these different city entities. Where is that inventory? I know Chris Daly, way back when, did you have some legislation that?
Yeah. So but it's just for the city. So no control over SFUSD, which is a separate entity. But for the city ones, if there's surplus property, it is required that it be turned over to the use of homeless people. What the departments have ended up doing is hiding their surplus property and basically trying to categorize it as not surplus, but they have not been able to sell stuff off. But there has been 3 buildings that were pretty major as a result of that. One of the big ones is 150 Otis, which is that really narrow building that Otis kind of hits Division and comes off of where Mission makes the turn into the Mission, and that has turned into housing for veterans. So there's been like 3. So it hasn't been as accessible as we had dreamed it would be, but it's a really good point. And we can follow suit with the rest of those entities and try to pass those same kind of legislation in those bodies. Yeah.
Actually, another point I want to make is 145 Leavenworth.
Yeah.
Is a development that's happening between Turk and Middlegate and Leavenworth, which is going to create shared housing, which is a classification of housing.
You're talking about the micro units or the
Exactly. Which I think they're proposing to take the 240 units at that site and use that to remove SRO housing from a number of SRO sites.
Yeah.
Which fundamentally guts, you know, bottom line housing for a whole swath of people.
Yeah. And the messed up thing about that is that what they did with their original building is that they held it vacant. So they've been sitting on, every time a tenant moved out, they held that thing vacant for years, which is just outrageous. And then all of a sudden they're going to say, well, we're not really losing any housing because nobody's living in there. I think they got like 1 tenant left now. And God knows what kind of tactics they use to get the rest of the tenants out, because there's a lot of problems in that building. And so they let it deteriorate, they treated people like crap, they did all this stuff, and then now they got an empty building, and then they're saying, yeah. So it's really messed up, because even though they're going to be building residential units, the rents are not going to be they're not going to be affordable to folks who would have lived in that building that they had pushed everyone out of. So, yeah.
A question in the back?
Yeah, are there any high-tech solutions you guys are working on? Like, it seems like some homeless do have phones, and you see a few finding shelter, things like that. Are there apps out there?
Yeah, I mean, there's no you know, I mean, technology is not going to solve homelessness. You know, housing is going to solve homelessness. And I think, you know, Hands Up is a good example of how to use technology in a way to you know, to address some fundamental needs that people have in terms of survival needs and stuff like that. But you know, there's certainly systems in place that could be radically improved, and I think you know, different nonprofits and, you know, city entities and stuff have a whole variety of different things, and you know, we just changed the access system to shelter, and I mentioned that, and that was like a you know, more of a little bit of a technology-based thing, but a 311 call center, and people can call in and do it. So there's that stuff out there.
Sendesk also did something with the mayor's office. It's called Link Us Up, right? And then that's like a mobile website that you can go to on your phone and find like nearby services and stuff.
Yeah, but the big problem, of course, with all of this stuff is that there's not enough services for people. So you can have a mobile app that tells you where to go to shelter, but the chances are it's going to be full. So that's, yeah.
Yeah. We got so many questions. Over there.
So fun, I love it.
Repeat the question. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, I can repeat the question.
Oh,
sure. Yeah, we can do that.
I just noticed versus other major metro areas that I've lived in, like New York City or Chicago, the homelessness issue in San Francisco is so much more visible. And I wonder, and I don't know if that is because other cities are better at hiding it or if they're actually addressing it more fully. And I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on that. Are there other cities out there, other than obviously I think Utah is a great example, but are there other major metro areas that are solving this problem better? Or
you're a much smaller city than LA or New York, and a lot of the services for that population are centered in the Tenderloin, and which makes it really convenient for them to get everything that they need, right? So
yeah, I mean, it's a part of it. I think is geographics, and so like, well, if we just look at New York City, for example, so New York City, you have Manhattan, and then you have all the boroughs.
Yeah.
And then, you know, the impoverished neighborhoods are in the high hundreds on Manhattan or out in the different boroughs. And so the visibility of homeless people is not going to be as large. And of course, you know, the heavy criminalization, you know, hasn't ended homelessness in New York City, but they certainly did attempt to do it that. But so part of it's a geographics issue. And I think, you know, San Francisco is different in terms of, you know, our center of commerce butts right up against our very poorest neighborhood. And then the way other cities are laid out, you have, you know,
that's a pretty fascinating history in and of itself, because the Tenderloin, you look at different strategies for preserving affordability in neighborhoods, and the Tenderloin was very aggressive about land acquisition 30, 40 years ago. And so, you know, whatever way, you know, they've been effective at keeping a large portion of their housing stock available and affordable to a lower income population. Whereas in the mission was very focused on rent control and evictions, and has a strategy that has different outcomes.
Yeah, and that's the interesting, I think that was kind of the question, was like, is it really a good sign that it's not as visible in New York or Chicago? You know, that it's more noticeable here, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're doing a better job at solving this issue. Like you said, they've just, even more so maybe than San Francisco, New York has criminalized homelessness and pushed it to these different areas where we've actually preserved more low-income neighborhoods in the center of the city as opposed to pushing it outside. So it's sort of, I mean, it's obviously a very complex issue, but I was just wondering if there was like, no, actually, this city is doing a great job, or if it's like, no, this is really, everybody has this problem and people just try to deal with it in different ways, so it's sort of, it looks different in different places.
Yeah, it's pretty much 7 to 9% of the extremely low-income population of any area any major urban area is experiencing homelessness. So it's pretty consistent number-wise. You know, there's kind of like highlights in all these different areas, and then there's lowlights too, right? So some people are doing stuff really cool, and then there's another area they're not doing it as well. And there's things in San Francisco as well. There's a lot of other stuff we do really badly. Yeah. So it's a mixed bag. Yeah.
So just a quick follow-on with that. So by the point-in-time count, which gives us about 6,500.
Do you want to explain how the point-in-time count works, just so everyone understands? Yeah,
sure.
It was really helpful.
The point-in-time count, get about 1,000 volunteers, city workers, volunteers around the neighborhood, and you go around and you walk the streets. You each get a map, and you have your area, and you walk or drive through the math and
It's
look.
biannual, right? It's every other year.
Every other year.
You take 1,000 volunteers, you go and you try and attempt to count the homeless population in San Francisco.
And so, yes, you have volunteers going in on the streets, then you have specialized crews, the hot team that goes into the parks, and then you also count who's in the jails, who's in the shelters, to get an overall count. But just at that moment, people could go out in a few hours and see. So San Francisco, 6,500, New York, about 20,000, LA, something like 39,000, according to the point-in-time counts from 2 years ago.
Yeah, and 39,000 relative to LA's population is much larger.
Right.
Population.
Yeah, that's really the more interesting number, right? The percentage.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so
Yeah.
my question for Jennifer is I want to say thank you for these days from 11 to 2 p.m. And I went last week and I learned about the California Right to Rest bill, which my understanding of what I learned in free school was that it didn't pass this year. It's alive for next year, but the main reason that they think it didn't pass is because the lawmakers are not educated enough about the issues and all these myths. So I guess my question is just about homelessness in San Francisco. It's so visible. It's an opportunity for us to bring people together, seeing it every day. What role do you think, rather than legislation and stuff, but education, really education focused on engaging our whole community?
Yeah, you know, that's so, the question was about what role education plays, or how we can do it. You know, that's a really good point, because the psyche, you know, this sort of bias against homeless people and even hatred against homeless people or assumptions about them, it's really resulted in this dehumanization. And so folks really, and actually there's a scientifically proven now, they did this brain scan thing and had objects and people, and when homeless people went in front of people, they actually did not register. The brain registered as an object or sometimes disgust and stuff like that. Like it was really actually, you know, physiologically different in the way that human beings in the United States view other human beings who are without housing. And so we have a huge wall to climb there. And certainly, you know, I think if people are, you know, in your churches, at your work or whatever, and want to arrange speaking engagements or have different groups that you're involved with, that's a great way to do it, and sending people out and really having that one-on-one education happening. You know, at times we'll do tabling and get, like, if anyone ever wants to do that, we're more than welcome. Like, give you some fact sheets, go out to, you know, neighborhood Noe Valley or Hayes Valley or wherever you usually are, and start, you know, and just start engaging the public in a discussion about homelessness. You know, any of that stuff, that's awesome. And we totally encourage it, because it's, we really need to shift that dynamic. It's creating a situation where it's absolutely impossible for us to end homelessness with this current way that homeless people are viewed.
The legislation is at the statewide level because it appears like it's so difficult to get stuff done at the local level. I mean, in Berkeley, you got a right to rest type of you know, measure that just passed. Not the right to rest, the opposite.
Sit-lie did not pass in Berkeley. It did pass in San Francisco. We won in Berkeley.
Well, it wasn't sit-lie. It was the recent.
Oh, the six anti-homeless. Yes.
Well, so I mean, well, anyway, it's an issue that's live at the local level, and I know that a lot of these cities, municipalities will post it at the statewide level, but that's why it's at the statewide level. Anyway, so my question is about the navigation center. I know it's very early yet, but
Can you explain what the navigation center so everyone knows what it is? Sorry, no,
I thought you guys said I can't.
We do. I mean, I know what it is, but I'm just worried the rest of the audience like doesn't know.
So the navigation center is a new, as I understand it, I'm sure you guys know better than I, it's a shelter that has been recently created in the city of San Francisco.
It's a one-stop shop. Basically for homeless people to come and figure out.
So I have questions related to the fact that I understand it was $3 million privately funded, but anyway, that a lot of the aspects of it have been more conducive to people who are homeless actually being able to use it, such as being able to bring their pets in, such as perhaps couples being able to go in together, families, whatever. Is that a function of the fact that it was privately financed, And also, are people doing something to track the data so that it might be replicable at some point?
So she was asking about the navigation center and whether it was replicable and why it was so different than the other providers. I get that question a lot, actually. So I think it was just the city could do it that way anytime they wanted. They're just choosing not to, and I think they were trying to focus on encampments. They wanted to try a different model. We actually used to, what we call it is low threshold shelters, where you don't have a lot of stuff to hop over. And we had those in San Francisco before, and we closed them all. And that was really kind of the culture of our human service agency. And so we'll see what happens now. But yeah, those other kind of barriers in other places around, being able to bring your pets and your belongings and your partners are not there, and that's pretty helpful. It's only 75 people that can stay there at a time, so I don't think it's going to make much of a visible difference on the streets. But it's great. We were like, public lands, it's going to sit there, and then we're going to later develop housing on it. Like, heck yeah, let's let homeless people stay there. So that was our thought about it the whole time, and continues to be. Yeah.
Over there.
So it appears to me that certainly something that put pressure on homelessness is the rising cost of real estate in San Francisco.
Yes. Yes.
And it appears to me also that obviously the economic opportunity created by the tech company, in which I also enjoy being part of that community, is one of the driving factor of that. And so because we all kind of part of it day in and day out, whether because our company is looking for a new office, or whether because we are looking for a new apartment to rent or to buy, or whatever that is, what are the considerations that we as individuals, as we are part of the system, need to make sure that are thought of, whether if our company is looking for a new office and a space in San Francisco, or whether we are personally looking for a new space for ourselves? Or is that something that is disjointed and we cannot do anything about?
I mean, I can try and answer it. I mean, it's a very, very complex coordination problem because there are north of 1,800 companies, tech companies in San Francisco. The number of tech workers here is somewhere close to, it's like 68,000 workers, somewhere like 67% of the population. You have like many different disparate entities that are kind of like, some stick around for a long time, some are just startups that are kind of like flash in the pan. So it's very difficult to figure out how to manage impacts. Some people have said like philanthropy is one way to go. You're taking it now. I'm talking about a number of different arrangements here. So
yeah, okay, let's talk about one that kind of works.
I'm talking about many different things. I'm not just talking only about philanthropy, but like, so there's many tools, different tools in the toolbox. Some are more probable and some are less probable, right? And so, Salesforce, for one, like Mark Benioff, who's a sixth-generation native to the Bay Area, is encouraging tech companies to do something called the 1% pledge, where you pledge 1% of your equity to philanthropy, either in the form of cash donations, time, or software employee like volunteering. And that's one route. On the progressive side, there are housing activists that are asking tech workers to take a pledge not to rent any Ellis Act evicted units. So just taking a formal boycott, we're not going to touch these units. There are, people have talked about like, I mean, if you want to get into, as I said, philanthropy is complex and difficult for a number of reasons. It's unpredictable. It's based on like whatever the company or the individual, feels like funding. It can change pretty capriciously. Other people have talked about more systemic things like looking at, if you want to look at tax structures and stuff, which is much, much, much more complicated because of the way property tax and commercial property tax is handled in the state of California, which is, we passed a law in 1978 which fundamentally changed California state and municipal finance, which pegged property tax at 1% of your assessed value, and your property tax only increases like something like 2% or less per year. And so it creates all these like bizarre junctures in the amount of property tax that different companies and homeowners are paying. And so, especially with commercial property owners. So you're ending up in a situation, there's a limited amount of both residential and commercial real estate in San Francisco. And some people are paying like a lot of property tax because they've been recently assessed, and some people are paying stuff from decades ago, which is significantly less. And all of that is meant to finance things like, our schools and our public services. And I think there's like a really important conversation and dialogue that needs to continue to happen there. And then also, we have a lot of restrictions on how we can like raise money for services as a city, and those are difficult because we have restrictions on like, things have to pass with 2/3 of voters for new revenue generating fees and taxes. And so it's very hard for the city to adjust the way it generates revenue in order to pay for services, especially in stress times like this. But there's I don't know if you want to add.
Well, I would just add, so on a personal level, like if you're looking for an apartment or to buy a place, beyond the Ellis Act, like really looking at what was there before, like I would talk to the neighbors and find out who was there and what was the situation before I engaged in that. And I do that with my own place that I live, like making sure that everything's kosher. And so, and then the same thing I feel like can be done in terms of locating companies and thinking about it in terms of, is there housing, if it's a large company, and are you placing it somewhere where there's housing available or not? And, and I think that from a kind of corporate responsibility, place, that's pretty huge too, because and that's not on the workers. I mean, people want to live close to where they're working. And if there's no housing available, it just, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think looking at those things for me.
Yeah, and the other thing I would also add is like, we do need to have a serious conversation regionally about how dense we want to be and how we want to grow. Because at the end of the day, like the past 4 to 5 years in San Francisco, between 10 and 20,000 people have moved here per year. And up until last year, we were only building about 1,000 units. And then last year we did 3,500 units. And if you have this huge gap between the number of people moving here and competing over a limited amount of housing, that is going to impact rents, and it's going to impact the differential between what rent-controlled tenants are paying and what the market rate rents are, which is then going to incentivize their landlords to be very aggressive or possibly abusive to them. And so I do think that we need to make sure that, if we are going to have people who are going to move here, who are going to move here anyways, that we're able to scale our infrastructure in a way to support them.
So
Yeah.
because that's kind of happening, and will happen for the next 5-10 years. I mean, the economy is growing, tech is booming, and it's going to continue for a while despite all the chatter about bubble or whatever that is.
Yeah.
But anyway, my point is like, is there a real discussion based on city planning or based on other things? That
We're a very, very participatory city that has many discussions about all city planning things, and our neighborhood plans take many, many years. And in fact, you're sitting in, I believe we were in Central somewhere, right? We were like between, there's a Central Soma plan going on right now. What?
Yeah. On the edge.
Yeah, and then, so that neighborhood plan has been going for like, I don't know, probably like 2 years, and there's a giant book, which is hundreds of pages, describing like all the different options for heights of different parcels of land in like a 28 block radius. And like it's very specific, and they have a very participatory process with lots of community meetings and everything. This is not a thing that just happens, willy-nilly.
Yeah, no, I get it. It's just a feeling is that it's not really working.
It's absolutely not working.
so my point being like, okay, what's
so part of that? I mean, I think, so I mean, depending on how much influence people have in the room and stuff, but part of the problem is that the city makes priorities, and they prioritize, this is a really corrupt city, let's just face it. So who's greasing whose wheel? And that's in a lot of ways ends up what happened. And we do have the participatory stuff, but we got a lot of housing ends up being very, very high end, and we were overproducing high end housing. And that tends to be who the powers that be in San Francisco cater to. I mean, but it goes all the way down. Any developers, like the whole process is just it's pretty corrupt. So that's an issue. But I think then, as individuals, what can we do? And so then I think it kind of comes back to personal responsibility and, and just making sure, at least for ourselves, that we're not adding harm to that mix. And then if we can, getting engaged in these discussions where we're really fighting to make sure that that we have a more fair process, because they're not building for building at income levels that most tech workers can afford either. Like it's just not, I mean, it's just way, way, way high end. And, like I look at that new development that just went up on, whatever it's called, on Market Street, Eva, whatever.
That
Yeah, the one on the right that's got the little greenery outside. So, I mean, one of my friends who, I mean, I don't know through work or whatever, but he's got a very, very well-paid job at the library, and his wife is a tech worker and makes pretty decent money, and they could afford a studio there, and they have their 2 kids with them. And it's cramped, and it's a very small studio. I mean, we're talking like, small. And so very uncomfortable.
I do want to,
So-
like in San Francisco, we have an inclusionary housing policy where if you're a developer building market rate units, you either have to build 12%, affordable subsidized units on site or 20% off site. And so inclusionary is a very complex policy. Cities like New York and San Francisco have embarked on it, in an age again where there's not a lot of federal or state financing for low-income housing. But if you want to, if you have an inclusionary policy, kind of the weird twist of it is if you want to build more permanently affordable units, the market has to be hot enough for, the market rate units to pencil out. And so it's like a kind of weird, I mean, it's a weird incentive system.
Yeah, and I mean, but they also, if you know anybody that's living in any of those affordable units, they make it really, really difficult for people.
It's a lottery. It's a lottery, and it's very hard to get.
Well, it's hard to get, it's a lottery, but also it's hard to maintain. They make you reassess your income every time. They put you through all this rigmarole. They're constantly evicting people. Like, they evicted everyone that moved into an affordable housing unit at that place on Market Street. And so, they moved them in, and then they moved them out immediately. And then, so it's, but it is helpful. But,
So you guys talk about new housing. Like, I had a mate who's an architect, and I asked him a question, because I live in a Victorian place with sleeps 9 people. And we had a thought one day. We thought, how many people could live here?
Right.
And we thought maybe 30 to 40 people could probably live in the space that we're living in.
You guys are comfortable with it.
There's a lot of people living like that. I mean, you go in the Mission and flats everywhere is one family per room and sharing a kitchen, and it is not a comfortable situation.
But I think because she was an architect, she had an opinion that she could probably make it. Smart space.
Yeah.
Are there any restrictions that the city is imposing on people to stop the increase in density?
To stop, so I mean, San Francisco has a pretty unique history around density. I mean, we had this in the 1970s, late 1960s, early 1970s. There was a really strong reaction all over the state of California to increase population growth and increase density. And this is partly because a lot of the flat, available, previously quite inexpensive land in the Los Angeles basin and the Bay Area got filled out by the late 60s. And so we started to deal with these issues around densification and what densification represented. And, pretty tacitly, densifying and changing from a single family, the ideal of, the single family home to multi-unit dwellings is you're kind of introducing people who are maybe lower income than you. And so there was a lot of reaction in terms of zoning and housing limits and all this kinds of stuff all over the suburban California to prevent that. And there was also a simultaneous set of concerns around unimpeded growth and its impact on the environment, which is totally legitimate as well. And so we created all these some good, some bad, environmental. There are environmental restrictions,
height limits.
Yeah, height limits. And so in the early 1970s, a lot of San Francisco basically just got downzoned. And a lot of that hasn't really changed since, except for the eastern neighborhoods, which are bearing most of the home production and housing production now. And that also happens to be where a lot of lower income communities live, while the single family home side of the western neighborhood doesn't really add a lot of density or housing units. So there are a lot of restrictions in density. Yeah.
There is, but they're not that strict on occupancy.
Yeah.
So, if people want to have, when people have overcrowding and stuff like that, and then pretty much in the Tenderloin, pretty much every garage is lived in. It's, and then the, water comes in when it rains and everything gets flooded. And it's kind of a nightmare, but they're really not strict on that particular point.
Because it seems like they all have, you were saying that people have a lot to gain, by increasing the density. It increase the amount of money that the
Yeah.
that people would make from it, but then you'd cheapen it for everybody else.
Yeah, but you'd also, like, in increasing density, you have to figure out things like, how do you pay for the impacts on transit? And what about the increased population and how they're, you know, people are going to want to send their kids to the schools here, which are all, like, legitimate infrastructure scaling questions that cities have to figure out how to finance and pay for. So it's not just, it's like a very complex income transfer problem. And there's also like, oh my God, if you build this really tall building and you block someone's view, they're of course going to be super vociferous about that because that's going to affect their property value. And so these are all the kinds of questions that you have to deal with densification and figuring out its economic impacts, costs and benefits to people and figuring out the right quid pro quo. It's really, really hard.
I was going to say last
okay,
question.
we got a last question.